He knocked on my door after a decade, and nothing would ever be the same again, because the past he ran from just caught up. I had spent the last decade trying to unlearn the hope. Hope that he was out there somewhere, alive. Hope that he'd pick up the phone. Hope that he'd show up at Mom's birthday or Dad's funeral, or at the very least, send a letter. But 10 years had passed, and as each one slipped away, that hope had rotted into something else, grief, then resignation, then anger. When Alex first disappeared, I searched obsessively. He was my older brother, my closest friend, the only person who had ever understood me in a house that never felt like home. I spent sleepless nights staring at our childhood photos, my fingers tracing his face, wondering where he had gone. Mom had prayed. Dad had cursed. The police had asked their questions and scribbled in their notebooks, but no one ever had an answer. And then, 10 years later, there was a knock at my door. It was late, too late for visitors. I had been sitting on my couch, half asleep in front of a flickering TV screen. When I heard it, 3 firm, steady knocks. Not hesitant, not rushed, just certain. I opened the door, and there he was. Alex. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't left without a word. Like he hadn't been a ghost for a decade. "Hey," he said. "It's been a while." He looked almost the same. Same sharp eyes, same cocky half-smile, same lazy stance like he had all the time in the world. But there was something else. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A shadow behind his eyes, a tension in the way he stood. I stared at him. My hands shook. My breath caught in my throat. For a split second, I thought I might be dreaming, that maybe my exhaustion had finally broken something inside me. Then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I punched him. My fist cracked against his jaw, and he stumbled back, cursing. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel relief. Just rage. "Where the hell have you been?" I spat. But Alex just wiped the blood from his lip and grinned like we were kids play fighting in the backyard again. And that was when I knew something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. I let him in. I shouldn't have, but I did. Because no matter how much I hated him in that moment, no matter how much I wanted to slam the door in his face, to leave him standing on my porch like he had left us behind, I couldn't ignore the fact that he was here. That after 10 years of silence, 10 years of empty Thanksgivings, 10 years of waiting for the call that would tell me they had found his body in a ditch somewhere, he had finally come back. I locked the door behind him, not sure if I was keeping the world out or keeping him in. Alex looked around like he had never been here before. His eyes skimmed over the framed photos on my walls, the ones of me at my college graduation, the ones with Mom before she got sick. There weren't any of Dad. He had died waiting for a son who never came home, and I never forgave him for it. Alex didn't say a word about any of it. Instead, he dropped onto my couch like he owned the place, stretching out like it was just another Friday night. I stood there, arms crossed, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't know what to ask first. "Where have you been? Why did you leave? Why didn't you come back when Dad died? When Mom got sick? When I needed you?" But Alex didn't offer any explanations. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't ask about Mom or Dad. Instead, he grinned. Like we had all just been playing a game, and I should be happy that he was finally back. "So," he said, kicking his feet up onto my coffee table, "what's new?" I wanted to hit him again, but I didn't. I just stood there, staring at him like he was a ghost, because in a way, he was. And for the first time, I started to wonder if I really wanted to know where he had been. Because something in his eyes told me that whatever it wasn't good. And whatever had brought him back, it wasn't over. Alex sat there like he had never been gone, like he hadn't missed an entire decade of our lives. His body took up space in my living room, but it felt unnatural, like an object that had been misplaced and didn't belong anymore. He stretched out on my couch, his arms draped carelessly over the cushions, his foot tapping idly against the coffee table. It was an old habit of his, restlessness. But this wasn't the same. This wasn't the lazy confidence of a man who had control over his own life. This was something else. Something forced. Something twitchy. His clothes were clean, but they didn't fit right. His jeans hung a little too loose at the waist, his t-shirt clinging to the sharp edges of a body that had grown leaner, harder. His face had changed too, more angles, less softness. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. I had spent my entire life looking into those eyes, reading every emotion he never said aloud. I had seen them filled with mischief when we were kids, gleaming with triumph when we pulled off some harmless scheme. dark with frustration when Dad pushed him too hard. Now, they were empty. Not emotionless. There was something there, but it wasn't anything I recognized. It was unreadable, like someone had stripped away everything that once made him Alex and left behind a carefully constructed shell. He looked at me, waiting for a reaction. Like he expected me to just accept this, to move forward without looking back. But I couldn't. For 10 years, I had lived in the absence of my brother. I had carried his weight, filled the space he left behind, explained his disappearance to people who stopped asking about him long before I did. I had stood by our father's hospital bed, listening to his shallow breaths, knowing the one thing he wanted, one last conversation with his eldest son, was never going to happen. I had spent nights beside Mom when she broke down, when grief hollowed her out, when she finally stopped hoping altogether. And now, after all of it, after the funeral, after the tears, after the anger that had burned so hot and so long I thought I had nothing left to feel for him, he was here. Not a phone call, not a letter, not even a goddamn explanation. Just here. The room felt too small. My skin felt too tight. I tried to make sense of it, tried to piece together any logical reason for his return. People don't just vanish for a decade unless they have a reason, and they don't come back unless something forces them to. That thought settled deep in my chest, pressing against my ribs. Alex wasn't here because he wanted to be. He wasn't here because he missed me, or because he felt guilty, or because he suddenly realized he had abandoned an entire family that had spent years waiting for him. He was here because he had no choice. And if he had no choice, then someone, was pulling the strings. Whatever had made him leave wasn't finished with him yet. And now that he was here, neither was I. The room felt wrong. I had spent years creating a life in this house, a quiet, controlled space where nothing unexpected happened. Now, my brother sat on my couch, his presence warping everything around him. He belonged to another time, a past I had buried, a version of my life that no longer existed. He leaned back like he was comfortable, but I could see the tension in his hands, the way his fingers flexed and curled against his thighs. He was trying too hard to seem relaxed, too controlled, like someone who had practiced this exact moment in his head. The performance would have worked on someone else, someone who didn't know him. But I had spent my entire life watching Alex lie his way through situations, flashing an easy grin when he was caught sneaking out, shrugging off responsibility when things got too complicated. This wasn't that. The old Alex had been careless, reckless, even. But this was different. This was measured, intentional. He wasn't here to reconnect. He wasn't here to explain. He was here because something had forced his hand. The thought curled inside my stomach, heavy and leaden. The air between us stretched, thick with things left unsaid. I could feel the shape of the questions pressing against my teeth, but I already knew he wasn't going to answer. Not truthfully. Not yet. He glanced around the room again, his gaze skimming past the family photos on the wall, lingering for half a second too long on the front door. A habit, an instinct, like he needed to know his exits. A slow, crawling unease settled into my bones. People who spent a decade running didn't stop unless something forced them to. And when they did, they weren't safe to be around. A sudden, sharp memory surfaced. Alex at 16, cutting through the backyard in the middle of the night, moving fast, quiet, his breath harsh in the humid summer air. I had been waiting up, watching from the bedroom window, confused by the way his shoulders had been tensed, by the way his hands had been clenched into fists. He had slipped inside, locking the door behind him, and when I asked where he had been, he had only said, "I had to handle something." That same energy filled the room now, a thick, invisible stench of something rotten, just beneath the surface. This wasn't a homecoming. This was a storm rolling in, and I was about to find out just how much damage it would leave behind. Having Alex in my house felt like letting a stray animal inside. He was familiar, but not really. He sat there, pretending like he belonged, but I could see the way his eyes flicked toward the door every now and then. He was ready to bolt. That made two of us. I didn't know what to say to him. There was too much, and at the same time, not enough. 10 years had passed. A decade of missed holidays, missed calls that were never made, people he had left behind. He hadn't been there when Dad died. He hadn't even known Mom had gotten sick. He didn't ask about any of it. And that told me everything. If he had come back because he cared, he would have asked. He would have at least acknowledged it. But he didn't. That meant whatever had brought him back had nothing to do with us. And everything to do with him. I should have kicked him out. I should have told him that if he didn't have answers, he didn't get to be here. But instead, I just sat there, watching him, waiting. Then he let it slip. He had been talking casual, like he was telling me about some normal part of his life. Except it wasn't normal. It wasn't even close. I had to leave, he said. I owed the wrong people a lot of money. I couldn't risk them coming after you. The second the words left his mouth, I knew he had messed up. His entire body stiffened, like he hadn't meant to say it out loud. His jaw clenched, and for the first time, there was something like real tension in his face. I sat there, absorbing what he had just said, feeling it settle over me like a slow-building sickness. He hadn't disappeared because of some accident. He hadn't gone off to start a new life. He had been running from people dangerous enough that he thought they would come for us. And now he was back, which meant either he thought it was safe again, or he was out of options. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever he had been running from, it wasn't finished. And now, neither was I. The second he said it, he knew he had screwed up. I could see it in the way his face locked up, how his shoulders stiffened like he wanted to grab the words and shove them back down his throat. He looked at me, waiting to see what I would do with the information. I just sat there, staring. I had spent 10 years trying to understand why he left. None of the explanations ever made sense. He wasn't the type to just pack up and go without saying anything. Even when we were kids and he did stupid things, he never left me completely in the dark. He'd give me some half-assed excuse, at least try to make me believe it was nothing. But this wasn't nothing. This was Alex running for his life. And now he had run right back here. I felt sick. He had said it so casually, like it was a minor inconvenience, like it was something that could just be brushed aside. He owed the wrong people money. Not regular people. Not banks or landlords, or some angry ex. He meant dangerous people. The kind that don't forget. The kind that don't forgive. For a moment, I thought about how stupid it was that I had ever been angry at him for not coming home. Because maybe he hadn't had a choice. Maybe if he had called, if he had reached out, the people he owed would have turned their attention to us. To me. To Mom. A cold realization settled in my stomach. If those people were still looking for him, and they found him here, they would find me too. He must have seen it on my face because he finally broke eye contact. That told me everything I needed to know. If he had come back because it was safe, he would have said it. If he had come back because he had taken care of it, he wouldn't have looked like he was ready to bolt every time a car passed outside. No, he hadn't come back because it was over. He had come back because he had nowhere else left to go. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Did they know he was here? Were they already looking? Had he just led them straight to my door? For the first time since I had opened the door, I wished I hadn't. I wished I had never answered the knock. Because if Alex had been running for 10 years and still wasn't free, then neither was I. I didn't sleep that night. Even after Alex disappeared onto the porch, I stayed in my room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath his feet outside. He wasn't pacing, which meant he wasn't planning to run. That should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Because if he wasn't leaving, then that meant he had nowhere left to go. For 10 years, I had imagined this moment. I had thought about what I would say if he ever came back, how I would demand answers, make him explain why he had left me, left Mom, left Dad to die without ever knowing what had happened to his son. I thought I would scream. I thought I would make him feel even half of what I had felt all these years. But now that he was here, none of that mattered. The anger hadn't disappeared. It still sat inside me, an ember waiting to catch flame. But it wasn't the thing holding me hostage anymore. It was something else. Something colder. A slow, creeping dread that wrapped itself around my ribs and refused to let go. Because now I knew the truth. He hadn't left us. He had been running. And whatever he had been running from might not be done with him yet. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, pale morning light was creeping through the curtains. For a second, I thought maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. Maybe Alex had never come back. Maybe I had built this entire nightmare in my head, and I would walk out into the living room to find nothing had changed. Then I smelled coffee. It was such a normal thing that it caught me off guard. I pushed myself out of bed and made my way to the kitchen, half expecting to find the place empty. But there he was, sitting at the table, hands wrapped around a mug like he had done this 1,000 times before. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he took a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the ceramic. And finally, for the first time since he knocked on my door, he looked tired of running. Alex didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, staring at his coffee like it held all the answers he didn't want to give. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything unsaid. For years, I had imagined what I would do if I ever saw him again. In every version, I made him explain himself. I forced him to answer for what he had done, for the years he had taken from us, for the grief he had left behind. But now that we were here, sitting in my kitchen, the anger didn't feel as sharp as it used to. I wasn't sure what I felt anymore. Alex finally let out a breath and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He looked different in the daylight, older, more worn down, like the weight he carried had settled into his bones. He wasn't just thinner. He was exhausted, and for the first time, I saw it for what it was. He wasn't here to make amends because he suddenly cared. He was here because he had run out of places to hide. The thought made my stomach turn. If he had spent 10 years keeping his distance, 10 years avoiding home, then something had to have changed for him to show up now. Something had forced his hand. The idea of that scared me more than anything. I pulled out a chair across from him and sat down. I wanted to ask what happened. I wanted to know who he had been running from, how deep in he had gotten. If there was a chance that this could follow him back here. To me, to Mom. But Alex just stared at his coffee, as if bracing himself for something inevitable. And that's when I realized he wasn't trying to figure out what to say. He was trying to decide how much he could tell me without making me part of it. For the first time since he had come back, I understood what was really happening. He wasn't just tired. He was afraid. And if Alex was afraid, then maybe I should be too. I studied him for a long time, trying to recognize the brother I once knew beneath the man in front of me. The reckless confidence he used to have was gone, replaced by something harder. He had been carrying this for years, through places I couldn't begin to imagine, and now it was finally catching up to him. He exhaled sharply and rubbed his face with his hands, the weight of everything settling over him like a storm cloud. I wanted to believe he had come back for a reason, that this wasn't just another stop on whatever path he had been walking for the last decade. And maybe, just maybe, he wanted that too. Alex didn't owe me anything. Not after 10 years of silence, not after making the choice to disappear without a word. But as we sat there, the weight of everything pressing between us, I realized something. I still wanted to understand. The anger, the resentment. It was still there, but it wasn't burning as hot as before. It was different now, colder, heavier. Because now I knew his absence wasn't just carelessness or selfishness. It was survival. And if it was survival, then I needed to know from what. I stared at him, waiting. He had spent the last decade keeping the truth buried, but I could see it now. The exhaustion, the hesitation. He wanted to tell me. He just didn't know how. He exhaled, rubbing his hands together before finally meeting my gaze. His shoulders squared, like he was bracing himself for impact. Then, finally, he spoke. He didn't give me all the details. He didn't tell me everything, but he gave me enough. The debt had been real. He had gotten in over his head with the kind of people who don't send polite reminders when you owe them. He had spent years trying to fix it, trying to outrun it, trying to make sure it never led back to us. But now, for the first time, he wasn't running anymore. He wanted to stop. He wanted to face it. The words settled over me like a weight I wasn't prepared for. Because if he was done running, that meant whatever came next. Whatever happened when the people he owed realized he wasn't hiding anymore was going to happen here. And I had a choice to make. I could walk away, leave him to deal with the mess he had spent a decade creating. Or I could help him clean it up. And even after everything, even after the years of silence, I knew what I was going to do. Because no matter what he had done, no matter how much I had hated him for leaving, he was still my brother. And this time, he wasn't going to do it alone. The decision wasn't made in some grand, dramatic moment. There was no big speech, no sudden surge of forgiveness, no cinematic realization where everything between us was instantly healed. It was quieter than that. Just a slow, steady acceptance that whatever had happened before, whatever anger I still felt, none of it mattered as much as what came next. Alex wasn't running anymore. And for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't chasing a ghost. We didn't talk much after that. Some things didn't need to be said. There was still too much unfinished, too much broken between us to pretend we were fine. But we sat there, drinking our coffee, both knowing that something had shifted. The next few days were strange. I hadn't planned for him to stay, but he didn't leave either. At first, I expected him to disappear again, to slip away like he had done before. But he didn't. Instead, he lingered. He helped with small things around the house, fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen, even went to pick up groceries when I was busy. He never said why. He just did it. And I let him. For the first time since he showed up, it didn't feel like I had a stranger in my house. One evening, I found him sitting on the back porch, watching the sky fade from orange to deep blue. He looked more at peace than I had seen him in years. I stood in the doorway, watching him, and realized I didn't feel like I was waiting for him to leave anymore. Maybe he wasn't either. Of course, things weren't magically fixed overnight. We still had a problem. The people he owed. That wasn't going to go away just because he had finally decided to stop running. But there was a difference now. He wasn't avoiding it anymore. He had a plan. I didn't press him for every detail, but I knew enough. He wasn't looking for some impossible way to erase the past. He was looking for a way to end it, to settle things once and for all so that it never followed him, or me again. He told me it would take time, that he wasn't naive enough to think that walking away would be easy, but he had learned a lot in the past 10 years. He wasn't the reckless idiot he had been when he got himself into this mess, and for the first time, he wasn't doing it alone. A week passed, then another. Mom called. She asked if Alex was still here, if he was okay. There was hesitation in her voice, hope, but fear too. I told her he was still here, that he was working on things. She didn't push for more, but I could tell she wanted to believe this time was different. And maybe it was. One night, Alex and I sat outside, the air thick with the smell of summer rain. He didn't say much, just sipped a beer and stared out at the darkened sky. But eventually, he spoke, voice quiet, like he wasn't even sure if he meant for me to hear it. He said he was tired of being someone people only talked about in past tense. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, letting the words settle. Because for the first time since he had walked back into my life, I realized something. He wasn't just looking for a way out of his past. He was looking for a reason to stay. And maybe, just maybe, he had finally found one.